Come with me on an oblique journey into a tangled visual poetics and politics of space and place, of creolized her, his, their, them stories, which reifies queer Coolie diasporas. This is how Michelle Mohabir introduces her creative essay documentary, Queer Coolie-tudes. Released in 2019, this film builds a mosaic of different queer Indo-Caribbean voices and experiences. Specifically, she includes 8 subjects whose ages range from being in their 20s to their mid-60s in the film. Herself, Omar, Andil, Mars, Lindsay, Leslie, Anthony, and Ryan alias Tifa.
Hi, welcome. The aim of this video essay is twofold. In the first instance, I will explore how the documentary establishes the dialogue between Indo-Caribbean identity and queerness through Mohabir's theoretical proposal of queer Coolie-tudes. In doing so, I contend that she offers a creolized and queered vision of the Coolie figure. In the second instance, this video essay will delve into how the documentary deploys a diasporic aesthetic that visually represents the in-betweenness and unreadability of the queer Coolie subject. In this part, Edouard Glissant's theory of opacity will be particularly relevant. Now, before focusing on the first part of the analysis, I believe that some terminological clarifications are needed. To begin with, Mohabir conceptualizes her theory of queer Coolie-tudes as an oblique politics and poetics of being queer and Coolie, acknowledging diasporic histories of indentureship and complicated in-between hybrid identities. Embodied as queer diasporic Coolies with roots and stances of the Caribbean, while being fluid diasporic bodies living in Canada. In this definition, Mohabir's reclamation of the term Coolie is reminiscent of Kaltarabuli's work. Historically, the term Coolie carried a deeply pejorative connotation, functioning as a racial slur during colonial times against Indian indentured laborers. These workers were brought on a bound contract to work on the worldwide plantations of the British colonies following the abolition of slavery in 1833. The term retained these negative undertones until the rise of reclamatory efforts in the 1970s. In Mohabir's words,
now there's a turn which simultaneously reclaims and troubles the racial slur of Coolie, a word which carried the stigma and weight of the colonial history of indenture, of how Indians came to the Caribbean and South America, to Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad, and Jamaica. Coolie is now embraced by some as a badge of empowerment, no longer as a marker of derision or shame.
Kaltarabuli is considered the founding author of this intellectual turn. In 1992, he published the book Caldetual Coolie-tude and coined the expression of Coolie-tude to describe and encapsulate the distinctive traits of indentured migration. While Mohabir's use of the term Coolie-tudes may apparently evoke Torabuli's theory, she clarifies in a conversation with Wahab that, as indicated by her distinct spelling of Coolie-tude, she takes on a different conceptual approach. Specifically, her notion of Coolie-tudes emerges as a derivative of Coolie and attitudes, and it intends to encapsulate a more creolized, diasporic, and queered vision of Indo-Caribbean experiences. Moving on to the film's exploration of Indo-Caribbean identities, one of the interviewed subjects perfectly summarizes their multiplicity.
The Caribbean is a Creole space. Everyone in the Caribbean has to engage with this fascinating mix of cultures that's always imbued with this violent history and also with pleasures of the present. Indo-Caribbean it's distinctly its own thing, and it's always shifting and moving, and any kind of identity framed around desire would also carry that fluidity and that movement.
Indeed, the Caribbean is described as a multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multicultural space that comprises people of African, Indian, Chinese, European, and indigenous descent. Hence why Stuart Hall defined it as the first, the original, and the purest diaspora. Unfortunately, as enriching as it can be, this diversity often entails some issues of belonging. which are effectively portrayed by the participants in the film. On the one hand, the centuries of slavery, indentureship, and colonialism in the Caribbean created some hostility between Afro-Caribbean and Indo-Caribbean communities. These racial tensions are often most acutely experienced by Dougla individuals who navigate the complexities of both heritages. The term Dougla is believed to originate from the Bhojpuri dialect, where it means bastard. In Trinidad and Tobago, however, it has been commonly adopted to refer to persons of mixed African and Indian heritage. One of the interview subjects in the documentary, Lindsay, identifies as Dougla and explains how this affects her sense of self.
And I think that being half Guyanese comes with its own separate identity struggle and its own politics, because in Guyana, there's been a lot of disparity between blacks or black slaves and Indian indentured laborers, and a lot of the conflict between the two. So I've almost internalized that conflict within my own self.
As illustrated by Lindsay's words, these racial tensions between Afro-Caribbean and Indo-Caribbean communities can be internalized by individuals. Leaving their historical tensions aside, Khan points out that these two communities still make up some of the largest ethnic groups in the Caribbean, often resulting in even less representation for other groups such as the Kalalu. Leslie, another one of the interview subjects, defines Kalalu in the following way.
Kalalu is a mixture of many different ingredients, spices, and the influences that have come from people from all over the world to this one little island.
Albeit meant to symbolize unity in diversity, Kalalu individuals do not always receive the same level of recognition or voice as the larger ethnic groups. All these issues of uprootedness are exacerbated by the fact that a significant part of Indo-Caribbean people endured a second migration to the global north. As a matter of fact, all the participants in the film live in Canada. With regard to this, Sankar establishes the concept of double diaspora, which has come to characterize the Indian Caribbean outside of the Caribbean. Further, she adds that this doubly diasporic community tends to develop a diasporic consciousness that breaks with any essentialized notions of identity. Considering this, it can be claimed that Mahabir's film represents the dialogic relationship between what Stuart Hall calls the two axes or vectors of Caribbean identities, the vector of similarity and continuity, and the vector of difference and rupture. In other words, although they share a common experience of diaspora, Indo-Caribbean communities are also shaped by many internal differences that are constantly being negotiated. In that sense, the film shows that Indo-Caribbean identities are a process of becoming rather than a fixed, accomplished fact. In doing so, it explores the Coolie as an already creolized figure that embodies many histories of migration, ethnicities, cultures, and historical tensions. Thus far, I have analyzed the film's creolized depiction of Coolie-tudes. Nevertheless, as mentioned in the introduction, Mahabir's documentary also puts Indo-Caribbean identity in conversation with queerness. She does this in such a way that, according to Alturi, troubles heteronormative notions of Caribbeanness and white Western notions of queerness. On the one hand, presenting the Coolie as a queer figure troubles heteronormative conceptions of Caribbeanness because dominant nationalist state discourses continue to relate legitimate citizenship with heterosexuality and particularly heteromasculinity. The correlation between heterosexuality, nationhood, and citizenship traces back to the colonial era, when British authorities equated sodomy with animality, thereby establishing heterosexual manhood as the standard of humanity and, by extension, citizenship. As a consequence, queer subjects have been constructed as external to Caribbeanness. In fact, popular tropes of Indo-Caribbean literature and scholarship such as the Jahahibai have attempted to erase the presence of homosexuality. The notion that queerness stands in opposition to Caribbeanness is reflected in a conversation between Ryan, one of the interviewees, and his father.
One time me and my dad got into an argument And he said to me, "You'll never be a Trini, you're just Portuguese." That stuck with me for years as one of the most hurtful things my dad said to me as he tried to remove my Caribbeanness from me because I wasn't adhering to his understanding of Caribbean masculinity.
As exemplified by this argument, many people hold the belief that being queer is incompatible with claiming a Caribbean identity. Nevertheless, by showing Indo-Caribbean participants who openly define themselves as gay, lesbian, gender fluid, and drag queens, Mahabir's film challenges this assumption. Not only that, but the film also works to construct the genealogy of queerness outside of North American frameworks. For example, the film adopts the term queer in a way that is not solely related to gender or sexuality. Instead, it shows how the coolie is a queer figure in itself because of its displacement and non-normativity.
To think about queer Coolie-tude, we need to think about queerness as violence and the effects of violence because of the indignities of indentureship. The coolie is a certain kind of queer figure. Queerness is different from the term queer that we use in North America. In North America, we tend to talk about queer identity. There is this notion of the identity of a person as gay or lesbian, etc.
Additionally, the coolie is conceived as a queer figure because it was often feminized. According to Perseidi, whereas Afro-Caribbean men were popularly constructed as dominant and hyper-masculine, the colonial imaginary attributed passivity and femininity to Indo-Caribbean men. The powerful effect of reclaiming the coolie as a queer feminized figure is defended by Mars, one of the participants.
I think it's important to reclaim the term coolie because it is equivalent to the N-word. For us being called that during indentured times and carrying on till now, it's obviously racialized, but it's also feminized in a way. I think that coolie was mainly a term that was targeted towards women in indentured slavery. And so to reclaim that term, especially for myself as a genderqueer feminine person, it troubles the idea of what coolie is in and of itself.
Lastly, the film effectively presents a vision of queerness that is not separated from Indo-Caribbeanness because many of the participants mentioned that they have built a queer aesthetics through their inclusion of Indo-Caribbean elements such as Bollywood, Carnival, soca chutney, and so on. For instance, Omar confesses that as a kid, he used to put on his mother's jewels and sari to emulate Bollywood stars. As another example of queering Indo-Caribbeanness, Ryan reveals that his drag name, Tifa Wine, is based on a wordplay that makes reference to Caribbean vernacular language and Carnival.
The name Tifa Wine draws upon a Caribbean vernacular language that we use in cultural spaces such as Carnival. It's a play on the term Tifa Wine, wine meaning the dance move that men and women and queer people do in soca spaces and other dance spaces where a man will come up behind a woman and start to whine on her. Whining is this sexy side-to-side pelvic dance move that people do together and do independently to show autonomy. So Tifa Wine is an exploration of my own queer Indo-Caribbeanness.
Even though Mahabir's film has been demonstrated to conceptualize the possibility of a creolized and queer Indo-Caribbean subjectivity, it should be emphasized that essentializing notions of cultural identity, homophobic nationalisms, and Western-centric definitions of queerness continue to obscure the full complexity of Indo-Caribbean subjects, making them difficult to read or understand. It is in relation to these issues of intelligibility that Edouard Glissant's theory of opacity becomes particularly relevant. All the participants in the film mention some kind of struggle connected to how they are perceived by others, whether in connection with their sexuality or their ethnicity. For example, Omar affirms that queer coolie people in Canada are given almost no visibility.
Categories such as the queer coolie cannot necessarily emerge. We constantly have to sort of be visible under the conditions that are set up, by larger structures. And so while we may actually have some affinity with the term queer South Asian, which has some tentative visibility, there is almost no visibility for the term queer coolie.
Likewise, Lindsay, Leslie, and Ryan describe some instances in which people don't know how to read their ethnicity or read it mistakenly because of the way they look.
So the Kalaloo identity is a blessing and a curse at the same time. because I fit into so many different races and cultures, and then I don't, because a Trini culture is so unique. People see me as Filipina or from, Latin America. Being mixed race is wonderful, but other people don't know how to deal with me.
I think I'm always read as mixed race wherever I go. People don't assume that I'm West Indian or that I'm Caribbean or that I'm Trinidadian. A lot of people have said like there's a specific Trinidadian look that I don't carry. I often get read as some type of Indian because of my skin color and my facial features. I get asked if I'm Mexican, Filipino, Indian. I've gotten Pakistani before. When I identify myself to people, I just say that I'm mixed race or that I'm biracial. When I enter South Asian spaces, people just assume I'm South Asian, and I have to tell them that I identify as Indo-Trinidadian. I don't get read as Portuguese either.
I think as a queer Douglas person, it's hard not to feel invisibilized in a lot of spaces, especially as someone who looks monoracial. I'm seen as just black in a lot of spaces, be it black or South Asian or Indo-Caribbean.
Admittedly, this lack of recognition by others might upset the subject's self-perception, making them feel like they do not belong anywhere. However, this unknowability can be used as a decolonial position of resistance. According to Murdoch, understanding or comprehension often imply a certain appropriation of the other, in which they are remade to fit within the vision of the other, of the viewer. Therefore, embracing opacity might be useful to avoid being transformed, to conform to universalizing assumptions, and instead preserve the right to diversity. Further, as Mahabir herself acknowledges in the conversation with Wahab, she considers that opacity allows the subject to signal their visibility in their own terms. Bringing this analysis to its concluding point, I would like to mention that all of the discussed themes, that is, the presentation of a creolized queer Coolie-tude and the adoption of opacity as a position of decolonial resistance, are also reflected in the film's diasporic aesthetic. As you will see in the following images, the content of Mahabir's work is deeply intertwined with its form.
Influenced by Black British cinema of the 80s and 90s, third cinema, and postmodern aesthetics, Mahabir develops diasporic aesthetics that visually convey the fluid multiplicity of the participants. For one, she includes many shots of the participants standing or sitting in front of the sea. This juxtaposition of the queer brown body with the sea clearly alludes to their histories of double migration. Specifically, there is a shot in which the saturation of the image is modified to make the water of the sea appear dark, in a clear reference to the Kalapani, or the black waters that indentured workers crossed to migrate to the Caribbean. At the same time, however, images of the sea are combined with shots of the subjects in front of trees. This amalgamation of the ocean and trees could hint at the idea that the roots of Indo-Caribbean subjects are found in movement, and roots are therefore transformed into roots. As for the participants' gender and sexual fluidity, they are also represented through the symbolic use of water. In the film, this is more obviously shown through the recordings of the queer participants wearing drag or traditional clothes while dancing in front of the ocean. Lastly, Mahabir plays with blurring and opacity throughout the whole film to render the participants resistant to closure of meaning. For example, there is a point in which one of the participants holds a mirror underwater, which results in their image being refracted and distorted. Also, there is a recurrent inclusion of masks in the film, signaling the participants' refusal to being appropriated or read outside of their terms.
From of this analysis, it can be concluded that Michelle Mahabir's queer Coolie-tudes reclaims the Coolie figure in a way that recognizes its cultural hybridity and queerness and constructs a visual poetics that accounts for their multiplicity, fluidity, and opacity. Thank you so much for watching.